to the Convention of Rights of Persons with Disability. Today, I want to say that this event is taking place in New York. We're currently in UN building and we're broadcasting live. And I hope that you will enjoy listening to information that we're going to share today. I want to use this opportunity to give a hearty thank you to International Disability Alliance, IDA. That's an organization that is a co-sponsor of this very important event. And also very, very, very much thank you a lot because they are supporting us in every possible way. I would like to say that this part now that follows will be technical details for people who are online. You have international interpretation. Also, you have voiced English and transcription that's available during this seminar. And I will kindly ask you that you turn off your microphones when you're not speaking, so we don't have the noise, and there will be time for comments and Q&As in the end of this webinar, the last 15 minutes. So you can contribute yourself as well. Let me present myself. I am Sanja Tarcaj. I'm from Croatia. I'm a deafblind person and a president of WFDB since very recent. And today I would like to clarify some things regarding the second global report. The second global report is focused on good practices and recommendation, as well as fostering inclusion of deafblind persons. That's also the goal of WFDB overall. We as a World Federation, we are funded in 2001. And in 2007, we attained consultative status at the United Nations Economic and Social Council. And also, we are member of the board of International Disability Alliance, IDA, which is a very important role as well. WFDB will, in this event, present our second global report on the inclusion of persons with deafblindness that was published last May. That means that this is not the first time we're talking about this. This is not the first public stance we have regarding this report. It's a second one. And it's very important because it shows the realistic situation of deafblind persons all over the world. We also want to present our project, SHAPES project, that is funded by EU Horizons 2020 program. And that is focused on elderly and quality of life of elderly people. Also, it is important to know that this second global report is actually building up on the first global report that was mostly focused on exclusion of deafblind persons and showing the examples where and how it did happen and occur, especially regarding the CRPD and SDGs conventions. So this report is showing good practices and inclusion. But more about second global report, we will hear later on from my colleague, Christopher Woodfield, and our program advisor for SHAPES project, Lucy. Now I would like to greet our representative of IDA member, Mr. Cattoli. Alliance, and he's representing International Federation of Spina Bifida and Hydrocephalus. So I would give the floor to him now, so he can say a couple of words to this event as well, and some welcoming remarks too. Kato, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Sonia, for these kind words. Good morning and good afternoon to all the attendees of this workshop. It is a pleasure for me to have the opportunity to share with you some introductory remarks as a board member of the International Disability Alliance, IDA, and as president of International Federation for Spina Bifida and Hydrocephalus, abbreviated IF. Similar to WFDB, our mission is to ensure and promote the full realization of all human rights and fundamental freedoms for persons with spina bifida and or hydrocephalus without discrimination of any kind on the basis of disability. Hereby, key activities include raising awareness, political advocacy, community building, and human rights education. For the WFDB, today's webinar, as part of the COSP16, is an important moment for awareness, especially since it coincides with the National Deafblind Awareness Month. Congratulations to the World Federation of the Deafblind, with the support of the International Disability Alliance, the Norwegian Association of the Deafblind, FNDB, with the financial support from the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation, NORAD, and the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for the publication of the second global report on good practices and recommendations for the inclusion of persons with deafblindness. Your overview report provides an excellent resource to not only better understand the situation of persons with deafblindness, but also learn about good practices and measures to increase and improve the inclusion of persons with deafblindness. Its case studies from different regions and specific recommendations to different stakeholders across the thematic areas provides a guidance and clear direction on how to achieve inclusion. We trust this report will serve as an advocacy tool for deafblind community members and their allies to stimulate collaboration and partnerships to advance the rights of persons with deafblindness, but also to inform stakeholders on how to better foster the inclusion of persons with deafblindness. This is similar to our journey at the International Federation for Spina Bifida and Hydrocephalus. The active involvement of the World Federation of the Deafblind as key stakeholder and the representative organization for persons with deafblindness in your EU-funded SHAPES project is important. In this way, you initiate and co-design key activities ensuring the perspectives and needs important to your community. It is my understanding that one of your key activities is similar to the work within our federation, which is the representation and active participation of all the persons with deafblindness. In short, compliments to the World Federation of the Deafblind for your important work and doing such a fantastic job to advance the rights of persons with deafblindness worldwide, reflected by both your recently published report and your active involvement in the SHAPES project. From the meetings this week as part of the COSP16, we have work to do to also reach underserved communities within both of our organizations representing persons with spina bifida and hydrocephalus and persons with deafblindness. Today's webinar is therefore important to give further awareness and ensure the recognition and respect of the rights of this distinct disability group. I wish you an inspiring meeting and a successful event. Back to you, Sonia.
Thank you very much, Kato, for this wonderful presentation. WFDB is a very proud member of IDA Council, and thanks to your support, WFDB can actually implement the motto "Nothing about deafblind without the deafblind." We are trying to do everything that you already stated, and we will keep on trying as well. Now, I would like to give the floor to Christopher Woodfield. He's a deafblind man and also one of the directors in the Helen Keller Center here in New York, and also an executive, a member of Executive Council of IDA. I'm very certain that he will give a wonderful presentation of the second global report. So Chris, you have the floor.
Okay. Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm just getting the PowerPoint established. So if you just give us a second, working out logistics. Okay. Hello, everyone. This is Christopher Woodfield signing. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this presentation from the World Federation of the Deafblind, specifically on the second global report. Just last week, I was able to give a similar presentation at the European Parliament. This is a much more reduced presentation given the time frame that we're allowed, so I will get to our significant points. Next slide, please. Let's see, is this on here? Okay, double checking. First, I'd like to mention about the first global report that took place before I go more in depth into the second. The first global report was a conceived partnership between the World Federation of the Deafblind, International Disability Alliance, the International Center for Evidence and Disability, and Sense International. All four of those partners came together to create this first global report. There were some very specific aims that were set out to achieve. It was to focus on the current situation of persons with deafblindness, and specifically to call attention to the gaps that are specifically related to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, CRPD. Because noticing that there was misalignment between representation of persons with deafblindness in those critical aspects. WFDB was able to move forward with the completion of this large report. Thirdly, in 2018, when we were in Benidorm, Spain, the Helen Keller World Conference took place. During that time, we were able to collect critical experiences from persons with deafblindness from around the globe. Next slide. Once that was completed and the information was gathered, a report was put together. Firstly, what became very important was that this document became a key resource on persons with deafblindness. Also, this was the largest population-based analysis of persons with deafblindness, which was based specifically on the Washington Group questions. The information yielded very specific data, which was a 0.2% to 2% of representation of the global population. A very extensive qualitative analysis was conducted across a wide range of policy areas. That included an extensive literature review. Input from the World Federation of the Deafblind occurred through a variety of methods. Next slide. The most urgent recommendations that came out of the first global report are as follows. Firstly, that there is a significant lack of a universal definition of the recognition of deafblindness as its own distinct disability. That deafblindness is not just deafness and blindness alone. That deafblindness is its own standalone unique disability. And this is of grave concern with lack of universal recognition. Secondly, is the lack of the provision of support of deafblind interpretation services. This includes interpreter guides and the lack of public funding to ensure most appropriate training and support and education to support individuals deafblindness to engage in work and community life with these supports. Thirdly, was a recognition of the need of additional research on issues concerning persons with deafblindness. There is a very rare amount of information that's available on the critical aspects related to persons with deafblindness. These were the top 3 urgent recommendations that came from the first global report. Next slide. Okay, now moving on to the second global report. You may be curious as to why that there was a need for a second report after those findings took place in the first. Well, it felt necessary to be able to build on the successes of the first global report and those particular findings. There was also a need to strengthen and consolidate the evidence that was discovered through the first report. The second report then goes into much more depth and detail on the issues that were identified. Sonia and Kato already mentioned some of these critical points, particularly around the best practices and case studies that would address particular questions on these 17 different points that were identified. And as well, to provide some concrete guidance to governments, other organizations, and agencies, particularly for people who focus on individuals with disabilities. There was a significant need to be able to identify the supports necessary for individuals with deafblindness. Lastly, the need to develop an advocacy tool specifically on representation of persons with deafblindness for those who are championing the efforts of those individuals. And also to make note that this report was not specific only on persons with deafblindness, but to see how the application could occur for other disability sectors in a more broad fashion. Next slide. So let me explain a little bit about the process in which the second global report came to fruition. There were several steps involved in that. The World Federation of the Deafblind board members provided a strategic guidance, validation, and oversight throughout the entire process. That was the role of WFDB. Secondly, there was a World Federation of the Deafblind policy advisor, a staff individual, and that person acted as a coordinator to make sure that all the pieces came together, collaborating with the project and the various partners in order to compile this global report. Thirdly, there was an advisory group established. Keep in mind, the WFDB representative was made available, which was myself. There was also a representative from Census International, from IDA, and various entities that participated in the advisory group. We came together to provide technical assistance, strategic guidance, outreach to persons with deaf blindness, and through other contacts and feedback all throughout the process. It was a collaborative effort, and everyone worked together to get to the aims identified. There were also various consultants that were involved that focused on both the qualitative and quantitative research aspects of this process. So bringing in various consultants were also a critical aspect based on their expertise to make this completion of the report a success. Next slide. Okay. Briefly, I will mention to you what is in the introductory chapters of the report. The first is on the methodology that was used. I mentioned both the qualitative and the quantitative research methods that were used to compile this data. Both of those methods were critical and then were aggregated together to be able to share this information. The qualitative aspects were the review of the literature, various studies that were available, surveys, narratives from individuals, etc. And then the quantitative measures were more on those Washington points that I mentioned, and the MICS, which I will go into a little bit later, which was representative from UNICEF on the focus on children globally. We looked at those data points and made sure that there was deafblind representation in the MICS data that came from UNICEF. So we looked specifically on that aspect as well, and we're able to aggregate all the information together in a quantitative and qualitative fashion. We'll also talk about report layout and the various points that were covered, but keep in mind, I only have time to elaborate on 2 out of those 17 today. Also, in the introductory chapter is a focus on the diversity of persons with deaf blindness. It talks about the onset of deaf blindness, whether it was congenital in nature or acquired. It talks specifically on various etiologies that causes deaf blindness, and also the impact of the different degrees of sensory loss, individuals who may be hard of hearing or have low vision, etc. These introductory chapters also includes prevalence data. I will expand again upon 2 of these items that were noted, specifically on the diversity and the prevalence data. Next slide. So again, of those 17 points that were highlighted, I will only be able to go into 2 of those today. Number 1 relates specifically to the legal recognition of deafblindness. As indicated in the first global report, that there was no international recognition of the definition regarding deafblindness. WFDB did an extensive outreach and surveyed about 30 different countries to gain information on this particular point, specifically on the definition of deafblindness as its own unique disability. So the survey was conducted, extensive outreach across 30 different countries, and it was determined that the Nordic definition that has been in use is really the best in terms of representation. The reason it was chosen is because it provides more of a social perspective as opposed to from the medical model. It pulls away from the specific definition and degrees as it relates to sensory access points and focuses more on a social aspect and a cultural connection. That definition also looks specifically on the impact of the experience of both of those sensory losses and the impact on the individual themselves. Again, it moved away from a very specific medical approach of the degrees of the different sensory losses. And so of all those definitions that were surveyed, it was the Nordic definition that came to the top. Secondly, focus specifically on the stigma and discrimination experienced by persons with deafblindness. Of course, individuals with disabilities globally experience discrimination, and that also includes persons with deafblindness. If you want to look more detail on that, please do take a look at the report or expansion. Thirdly, focus on disability-specific services. Again, through the lens of the life experience of persons with deafblindness. There may be services out there that are available to individuals with disabilities. However, those services may not be satisfactory to the needs of persons with deafblindness. As a sub-bullet, need to look specifically around the identification, assessment, and referral process for individuals with deafblindness. Need to look at successful strategies in each one of these components: identification, assessment, and referral. The next sub-bullet, focus on rehabilitation and communication. Focusing on training and communication access points. Again, please look into the report for more details on these. The third sub-bullet related to accessibility and assistive devices and technology. Persons with deafblindness rely very heavily on assistive technology and various devices that are made available to them, because otherwise they would not have the capacity to be able to reach out and communicate as needed. It's critical to take a specific look at how those devices can be made accessible for individuals with deafblindness worldwide. Lastly, on this sub-bullet, relates to interpreter guides and vibe assistance. Again, it shows the critical need for interpreter guides and assistance in a variety of capacities that is impactful in all areas of our lives. Specifically, we need to look at government support funding options that would support these efforts in moving them forward. Next bullet relates to participation. Looking at how persons with deafblindness can participate more wholly in their social community, as opposed to staying in an isolated experience. That is more detailed in the report as well. Lastly on this slide is data collection research. And I have to say, without data and collecting this information, don't know where we are, and it's such a critical aspect that will help us move forward. It's very critical to be able to have the proof to be able to support the statements that we make. This is why we have combined the findings from the first global report and a more detailed in the second report. But that is just the beginning. There is more research and data collection that is necessary in going forward. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm taking a look at the time. I know we're short. So this is the last list of points that I want to share with you. Specifically related to the focus on laws, policies, and services. One critical point relates to inclusive education. What the report has shown is that access to the general education curriculum for students with deafblindness is extremely underserved. We have to take a specific look at how we can even the playing field to make education accessible to students. Secondly, relates to health. Taking a look at healthcare services for the general population is much more accessible and much more advanced for individuals with deafblindness. Whether limited or no access to healthcare was found. Those results were much lower and much poorer in the representation of the general population. Thirdly, related to work and vocational training. It was noted that the employment rate for individuals with deafblindness was significantly lower than those of the general population. Again, how do we raise the bar in those standards that would allow access to more, raise the access points for work and vocational training? Fourth, social protection. This is often absent in the life experience of persons with deafblindness, as they often have a more vulnerable experience. It is proposed that we take a specific look at the benefits for social protection for those individuals with deafblindness. Fifth is participation in public and political life, such as the election process, being involved in activism, being a representation of the community. Typically speaking, persons with deafblindness have been excluded from those opportunities. There are many groups of individuals with disabilities that are advocates and are engaged in activism. However, even those efforts may not have included persons with deafblindness to date. So those efforts also need to be looked at. The report goes into further depth on that. The next point relates to recreation and social life. Of course, all individuals must enjoy their recreation time, to be involved in hobbies and various activities, and that includes persons with deafblindness. Oftentimes, the recreational and leisure experiences of individuals with deafblindness are much more limited, which also relates to the access to interpreter guides and various supports that would support that individual to get out into the community and engage in different social experiences. There's one individual, Carrie Thompson, who is a friend of mine, who lives in Boston, Massachusetts in the United States. actually established a dance studio. It's their own business that they came up with. And the idea behind that was to teach dance lessons, and it was open to all individuals. It wasn't focused only on persons with deafblindness. It was just an idea of total inclusion. Hearing people signed up for this dance class, and when they got there, realized that there were persons with deafblindness also in the class. And as they moved ahead, saw the successes in that. They were able to provide free access to deafblind individuals and also provided interpreter guides and supports to make the class a success. This allowed persons with deafblindness to participate in the dance class just as equally as those of the general population. Individuals of the general population who signed up paid for the coursework, the funds were collected, and then those funds were the revenue profits of the person who established the business. But again, this is a great opportunity, one example, to show inclusion of persons with deafblindness in a social experience. And this, again, is detailed as well in the global report. Lastly, second to last relates to preventing violence. As mentioned before, persons with deafblindness are actually one of the most vulnerable populations globally. As you might imagine, it's quite easy to take advantage of someone who has limited access to information or resources. We need to take a look at ways in which we can prevent that violence from occurring. Lastly, on this slide is response to emergencies. Oftentimes in emergency preparedness, there's many efforts that may take place to the general population. This may sometimes include persons with disabilities, but generally speaking, if that person with a disability is involved in emergency preparedness strategies, that does not mean that a person with deafblindness has been included. So we need to think about more extensively about how we can broaden the representation and make sure that persons with deafblindness are included in all these efforts. So again, these are just two highlights from the list of 17 points that are more detailed in the report. And now I'd like to move on to the next slide that talks about some of the conclusions that were found. Ooh, excuse me. Prior to moving on to that, I do want to mention prevalence. This is such a critical point. I just want to be able to share some of this with you. Yes, let me move on to those specific numbers. So the quantitative findings that I had mentioned earlier. In the first global report, the numbers that were found were 0.2 to 2.1% of the global population has what's called severe deafblindness. Estimating that 0.1% of the population of under the age of 40 years has deafblindness, and then could be potentially up to 6% of the general population of individuals aged 75 and older were identified as having deafblindness. Then, in the second global report, there was a stronger focus on children between the ages of 2 to 17 years old. This report indicated that 0.05% of children within that age range were identified as having severe deafblindness, which might mean that an individual has no access to vision and no access to hearing. This number could be translated into essentially 5%. Now, if we take a look at what might be considered moderate deafblindness, that might mean someone who has both a fairly moderate level of both hearing and vision loss. That number would represented essentially 14 out of 10,000 children, or 0.14%. Then representing individuals with mild deafblindness means perhaps a milder impact on both vision and hearing, and was represented of 70 out of 10,000 individuals, or 0.7%. All of these numbers together total just over 1.8 million children in a total of 36 countries that was collected through extensive surveys. Next slide. Now I'd like to close focusing on some of the overarching questions. The first being that there is now more of an increased awareness of the situation of persons with deafblindness. So that was a very positive outcome of these efforts. However, governments, NGOs, OPDs, etc., must establish a clear understanding of ways in which to support and identify persons with deafblindness. The second, identified key barriers, which included stigma that was mentioned, misperceptions about capabilities, lack of access to interpreter guides, limited or lack of access to information, the low incidence rates in terms of identification, the high support needs of individuals with deafblindness, the complexity of the different interventions that are necessary, lack of technical understanding and resources, and isolation. Those are a list of components that are identified as key barriers for persons with deafblindness. This second global report aims to improve the position of persons with deafblindness within disability, within the broader mainstream services. Next slide. These are the last 2 points on overarching conclusions. It also was a call for a global mechanism to be established that addresses systemic gaps in live assistance, which includes interpreter guides, and also being in alignment with other groups of persons with disabilities, which in doing so would champion the efforts forward for persons with deafblindness. Lastly, of course, it was the recognition of that there is a long way to go to make these aims. However, we're starting to see that there are different pilot programs that are being established that are addressing many of these components that we have been listed today. Next slide. So for a very quick review before we close, are the urgent priorities that came out of, again, the first global report. Remember, again, it was the lack of universal and national recognition of a definition on deafblindness. The second is the lack of the required support, specifically on deafblind interpretation services. And thirdly, the grave need for additional research on data collection. So those were the 3 top urgent priorities identified in the first global report. Here are those urgent priorities identified from the second global report. The first report had 3 urgent priorities. The second report has 4 identified. The first being to establish an international, national, and subnational or regional recognition of deafblindness as its own disability. That remains a top priority across both of these reports. Secondly, to establish a system for informational resources and continuous training on deafblindness, specifically for essential frontline workers. And so that can mean anyone involved in the life of a person with deafblindness, healthcare, education, rehabilitation, etc. All of the aspects that impact the life of a person with deafblindness. Those individuals who come in contact with persons would be considered those essential frontline workers. Thirdly, to establish public funding for live assistance for persons with deafblindness, which may include teaching assistants, interpreter guides, etc. Both in school and also life outside of school. That public funding must be established. And the fourth is to provide further funding for more research, again, to collect the necessary data to support these aims. While there might be 17 points identified, there must be future funding to go more in depth to find more details on these points. You can see this more expanded upon, of course, in the second global report. What we want to make available to you all as some critical resources is, of course, the first global report is available for your reading, as well as the second. The links are provided here. Remember again, the first global report provides sort of an introduction and a foundation to the needs. The second goes much more in depth to identify these barriers and identifying various strategies. Thank you so much for your attention during this presentation.
Thank you very much, Christopher. You really had a wonderful presentation and you able to summarize it very well and share the key points of this report. So I'm very grateful for your contribution to this. Now, I would like to give a floor to our colleague, Lucia Darino. She's a project manager for SHAPES project, and she's also working in WFDB. She's a very important person that makes our visibility and progress happen. And now I would like to kindly ask her to tell us more details about SHAPES project. And I hope that we will have enough time for your presentation and Q&As. So Lucia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Sania, for the kind words. I will now proceed to present WFDB's involvement in the SHAPES project, and I will talk a little bit about the inclusion of older persons with deafblindness in this project. So just to share some information in numbers, the SHAPES project is a 48-month project. It started in November 2019 and it will end in October 2023. So we only have a couple of months left. There is more than 300 staff members that have been employed either directly or indirectly by the SHAPES project. And it is composed of a consortium of 36 organizations, which includes WFDB. It also involves 14 European countries. And it engages with more than 2,000 older adults, which include older people with deafblindness, in 15 pilot sites. There are also 10 work packages in this project, and the project has received 21 million in EU funding, sorry. So as we can see, the Shapes project is a large scale project, and it has two main visions, which is on one side to build an open platform that will include digital technologies to improve the lives of older people. And these technologies include, for example, assistive robots, wearables, so they can be smart watches, for example, mobile applications, etc. So the aim of the Shapes projects is to facilitate long-term healthy and active aging and maintaining a high quality of life of older people in the community. So WFDB's role in the project is, in our opinion, very interesting and very impactful. So as I mentioned, WFDB is a consortium member, and we bring to Shapes the perspective of the deafblind community. So when we talk about the deafblind community, we not only mean persons with deafblindness, we also mean deafblind interpreters or guide interpreters. We mean family members. So we're talking about the whole ecosystem of persons with deafblindness. And we also try to showcase the diversity. So we really try to show that persons with deafblindness are very different, have different needs, communication systems, accessibility requirements, etc. We also contribute with our understanding on our members in the understanding of the situation of persons with deafblindness and their diverse needs. More specifically on topics related to health, so access to health, ensuring that persons with deafblindness have a healthy aging, technology. So this means access to technology, making sure that assistive devices are there, are available, and are shared. And also accessibility. So really ensuring that accessibility measures and standards are respected, and that can be both physical and environmental accessibility, but also overcoming attitudinal barriers. So really avoiding the stigma and the stereotypes that often are associated with persons with deafblindness. We also advocate for the inclusion and the rights of persons with deafblindness in the project, and more specifically, older persons with deafblindness. So within the project, which is focusing on the EU or Europe in this case, when we talk about older people, we refer to people that are 65 years or older. And again, we use the CRPD as our basis. So really, this is what we use as the framework when we try to advocate for the rights of older persons with deafblindness. We also coordinate with WFDB members the involvement of older persons with deafblindness, and we make sure that persons with deafblindness are involved throughout the project, throughout the work packages, and throughout the different activities. So what are our general objectives? So WFDB intends to be involved in all key processes of the project. We also see this as an excellent opportunity to collect data on the situation of older people with deafblindness. Again, raise awareness on deafblindness as a distinct disability, also in line with the second global report, which Chris just presented. We also try to ensure that the platform and the digital solutions that are developed as part of the project are inclusive of persons with deafblindness. And we're also studying ways in which technology can prevent exclusion and isolation of older people with deafblindness, which we know is a very big issue of this specific group. And we also disseminate the results both internally within Shapes and also externally through the reports, articles, journals, our website, social media, etc. So to share some of examples of our work, we have had older people with deafblindness testing digital solutions, providing feedback. We have also had our board representatives testing some of the digital solutions and sharing their views. We have also conducted interviews and focus groups with older people with deafblindness on different topics, such as barriers to access to technology, barriers to access to health, etc. We have also produced reports that document these challenges and provide recommendations. In the second global report presented by Chris, we also included a section on the SHAPES project, and we shared the case study of a woman, an older woman with deafblindness from Spain, and her experience with assistive devices and technology. Also, we're proud to say that 3 workshops have been held where we have been involving WFDB representatives and where we have been able to update and involve our board members. We have also publicated internal reports on how to improve the accessibility of the project and shared this with the different consortium partners. And we continue making assessments on SHAPES, its resources, its promotional materials. So this is a continuous effort to make sure that the project is as inclusive as possible. So we have been involved in several publications. I'm not going to go over all of them, but this is just to showcase that we have shed light on different topics such as the red and white cane, interpreters, deafblind interpreters, the ecosystem of persons with deafblindness, and we are happy to have been involved in different publications and co-authored different articles. So I come to my next slide, which is why is SHAPES an example of a good practice? Why are we talking about SHAPES? So we consider that this project is an excellent example of how to include persons with deafblindness. And we're very proud to be involved in the project because it's not so common that persons with deafblindness and their representative organizations are involved in large-scale mainstream programs. So to give some reasons as to why we consider this a good practice, 2 disability organizations are consortium partners. So this includes the European Union of the Deaf and obviously WFDB. Our organization was involved from early planning stages. And this is very important because we had a seat at the table from the beginning, which means we were able to plan our involvement. Reasonable accommodations are reflected in the budget. So this includes sign language interpreters, travel expenses covered for interpreters, etc. Also, accessibility meetings are often held to continuously evaluate the accessibility of the project. And inclusion and accessibility has been adopted as a cross-cutting requirement. So this is not just the responsibility of one organization or one specific task, but there are efforts to make sure that inclusion and accessibility is included throughout the project. Also, WFDB has been able to maintain the ownership of the project and the decision-making power, and that has been very important. Our board members have been able to decide the direction of the project to some extent and what activities we wanted to be involved in. Also, the project has connected the disability community with hundreds of stakeholders around the EU. There has been a direct involvement and participation of end users with different types of disabilities. So not only deafblindness, but also other groups. I would say there is now an increased awareness on disability, inclusion, accessibility, both internally within the project with our 36 partners, but also externally. And we have been able to collect data and information on older people with disabilities, and specifically older persons with deaf blindness. So we're very proud to say that we are working on a global report on older persons with deaf blindness, which we hope to publish before the end of the year, where we will include the findings of the SHAPES project, but also include information on the situation of older persons with deaf blindness from other regions outside of Europe. So we really want to broaden our scope and use this report to continue advocating for the importance of including persons with deaf blindness and their representative organizations in mainstream projects. It has happened. This is an example. It works. The collaboration is excellent, but it's important to emphasize that their funds, the capacity and the resources must be there and must be there from the beginning. But we're very proud to say that if collaboration and the financial resources are there, it is possible to include persons with deaf blindness, and we have been able to do it so fruitfully. So this is a quick summary. I share my email address on the slide, which is projects@wfdb.eu. Feel free to reach out if you like more information, or would you like to share any other information on older persons with deaf blindness, since we're putting together this global report. I also share the official website of the project, which is shapes2020.eu. And I remain available for any questions. I'm aware of the time, so I will now pass the floor back to our moderator, Sania.
Thank you very much, Lucia, for this wonderful presentation regarding SHAPES project. Your contribution cannot be measured. Listening to you, to Chris and Keto, all our today's speakers, I have a feeling that the dream of deaf-blind persons is becoming a reality step by step. It's the perfect time for a global deaf-blind movement, and I really hope that all of us together in joint efforts are gonna be able to do that. We have a little more time remaining, 10 minutes, so we're open for commentary and for questions by all the participants. Everything that we don't have the time to cover today, you can send by email on our official email addresses. So if there are any comments or questions, I'm giving the floor to participants.
Hi, everybody. So I'm looking at the questions, and I see that there has been a question on Botswana and challenges in the education of children with deaf blindness. So we want to say that we have included information on children with deaf blindness, but the recommendations are more general about persons with deaf blindness in general. But please refer to our specific chapter on education. So you will there find more specific details on what's the situation like and what are the recommendations. But I would like to give the floor to Chris in case he would like to intervene. So the question is more specifically, what are the key measures that can be adopted to support the inclusion of children with deaf blindness in education? So Chris, feel free to intervene if you have anything else to add.
This is Chris Woodfill signing. Yes, I can make a few key recommendations that came out of the global report, specifically as it relates to education for children with deafblindness. One very critical aspect is the need for live assistance. That relates to teaching assistants in the classrooms, and the term that we use for that is interveners. I know there are different terminologies that identify this role in the classroom, but here in the States, when we talk about live assistance, that is the role that's referred to. Secondly, you'll see in the global report is the idea of mainstreaming education. Now, that is in of itself a controversial issue from within the deafblind adult community. Because there's different ideas of what segregated settings might be. But we have to think, where are we working from? If it is from the alignment of the SDGs and the CRPD, but specifically, that language talks about the mainstreaming of education of children with deafblindness. Also, we need to look at the establishment of a curriculum that allows for the full inclusion of children with deafblindness into the education system. And very specifically, to establish teacher education programs to be able to educate students with deafblindness. Not only the live assistants that we're referring to in the classroom, but pre-service programs that would educate teachers. Again, live assistants, establishing a curriculum, and also educational training programs. Lucia, does that address the question?
Sorry. Yes, thank you, Chris, for that. And as I said, the report is divided in different chapters, as Chris presented, and there, we have one specific on education. So please refer to the chapter for more specific information on that. So I see that there is a question on elderly population with deafblindness and what kind of intervention or support is being considered in addition to technology. So if you are referring specifically about the SHAPES project, this is an innovation action project, which means it focuses specifically on technology and the integration of assistive devices as well. So this is the topic or the theme of the project. However, in our global future global report on older persons with deafblindness, we intend to obviously include other topics. So those would include isolation, mental health, deafblindness when it's acquired as a cause of aging. So we really want to include, you know, a more broader perspective than not just technology, although of course we will include the findings of the SHAPES project. But we're doing research, we're currently doing research on other topics. And if you have any resources or suggestions, please feel free to drop us an email. We are going to reach out soon to our members to collect more data, but any data that you have, any good practices, examples, case studies on older people with deafblindness, we'd love to hear from them. As I said, this is a global report, so we're including, you know, pretty much all of the regions in the world. So please feel free to reach out. We'd love to hear from you. And I see there is another question on a plan for a third global report. Currently, we have no plans. We are not conducting any research for the third global report. However, we would love for this to become a reality. We're open to looking for new means of collaboration, obtaining funds for it. As I mentioned, the Shapes project ends in October this year. So we are open to looking for, to collaborating and finding new sources of funding for sure. So yes, fingers crossed that the third global report can be a reality in a few years' time. I will pass the floor back to Sania in case she has anything else to add, and I believe we have a couple of minutes left. Thank you.
First, I wanted to use this opportunity to say thank you to all of our speakers that we had today and all the interpreters that gave us support to make this happen. And most important of all, what I want to say is that for all the participants that are included today in this event, that you can keep on looking for new informations and updates on our official pages, Facebook and other social media. Important thing to remember is that alone we can do so little, but together we can do so much. So support from all the participants is very valuable, and we can do much more with your support. In remembering and to respect the Helen Keller Week, where we can see that there are a lot of events and happenings to remember her and in regard to that week. And I hope that you can also follow that on social media and enjoy the Deaf Blindness Awareness Raising Month. Thank you very much for being here, and I hope to see you soon in some other opportunity.